So some examples of how privilege is constructed by the external conditions would be wearing glasses or being tall, my being from the US in Finland versus my being from the US in Iran, or being Korean in the US versus being Korean in Japan. So what I mean by that is that the society can construct whether or not wearing glasses in some way or another helps or hinders you in the society. We may think that being tall is an advantage and that you may have privilege in the society if people see being tall as associated with being important. But what happens if you're in a place where you have to exist in a cave? Then being tall is no longer a privilege, and being short may be. Being Korean in the US is seen as something very positive because of the history that we have. But because of the social history between Korea and Japan, Korean nationality students in Japan don't fare as well academically as they do in the US. This is not having anything to do with inherently being Korean or inherently being tall. It has to do with the social situation that you're in. So I'd like you to think of a place where you might be treated well simply because you're Finnish, or because you're female or male, simply because you're the age that you are, or the place that you were born, or what your parents do for a work or for a living. Now think again, where is a place that you might be treated badly simply because you're Finnish, or that you're female, or that you're the age that you are, or the place where you were born, or what your parents do for work? You didn't change, the circumstances around you changed. And that's how privilege functions in terms of the society. An important thing about privilege is that we don't ask for it, and we can't give it up. We all experience privilege in certain ways, and some of that is earned by what we have done as individuals, but some of this is unearned. So for example, if we're in this course, then we've had access to higher education. We don't ask for the power and privilege that come from that education necessarily, but we do benefit from it. But some of us worked harder than others to get here, and some of us will benefit more than others. What does privilege and power look like? Well, there's privilege and power in not being asked, oh, where are you from? What are you? How did you learn Finnish so well? There's power and privilege in being able to put a picture of your spouse on the wall of your office and not have people look at you twice because you're the same gender as your spouse. There's power and privilege in being able to walk up the stairs without a second thought and not having to figure out how your wheelchair is going to navigate the hallway. There's privilege in being born into the mainstream. So if you are born into a culture that shares the values and practices of school, the mainstream or dominant culture, then you have a much better chance of scholastic success. You don't have to spend time and energy learning the culture of schooling because that culture is consistent with much of what you've already learned at home. And knowing the language is one example. Another important concept in creating a culturally responsive classroom is that of privilege. Understanding what it is, how to combat it, and how to help your students have equal access to all the benefits of your teaching. According to Alan Johnson, privilege exists when one group has something that is systematically denied to others, not because of who they are or what they've done or not done, but because of the social category that they belong to. Privilege is a feature of social systems and not individuals. So it's important to recognize is that we're always participating in something that's bigger than us, in social systems that are part of the economics, the politics, and the social structure of the society that we live in. And people have or don't have privilege depending on the system that they're in and the social categories that other people put them in. Privilege is connected to oppression. If one person has privilege, somebody else does not. Yamamoto says, while in one sense we all have power, we also have to look at the fact that in our society and in most societies, people are stratified into various classes, and some of these classes have more privilege than others. We can think about this along racial lines and white privilege. We can think about this along gender lines and male privilege. We can think about this along sexual orientation and heterosexual privilege. Each society constructs identity in different ways. So in school, we have to think about that there's privilege in being born into the mainstream. If you're born into a culture that shares the values and practices of school, for example, you already know when school starts, or you know that you're supposed to wear a uniform or not to wear a uniform, then you have a much better chance of scholastic success. You don't have to spend time and energy learning the culture of schooling because that culture of schooling is already associated and consistent with the cultural practices that you have at home. One example of this is knowing the language. What does privilege look like? There's power and privilege in being able to assume that the history texts reflect the contributions of your social group. This is likely the same group that has historically owned the publishing companies and controlled or strongly influenced educational policy. Alan Johnson tells us that the problem of privilege is that those who have it often don't know it, or do they recognize the extent to which it affects their lives. Now, having privilege doesn't necessarily lead to a good life. This can prompt people in privileged groups to deny even resentfully that they even have it. And having privilege doesn't mean that someone's a bad person, but it does mean that there isn't one person that's a member of a dominant group who doesn't have issues of privilege to deal with, both internally and externally, in relationship to the world around them. You don't have any reason to feel guilty about having privilege because you didn't do anything, you didn't ask for it. But because you can't give it up in the external society, you also have to pay attention when you have it. Here's another example from school. In the United States, for example, not all students read about people like themselves in textbooks. Takaki asks us, what happens when historians leave out many of America's peoples? What happens, to borrow the words of Adrienne Rich, when someone with the authority of a teacher describes a society and you are not in it? Let's think for a minute about whether there's anything similar in Finland. Whose history is in the textbooks? Who do you read about in literature? And are all the students who are in your classroom equally reflected in the materials that you have available to teach with? Power and privilege are hard to see from the perspective of privilege. Peggy McIntosh, who's an educator in the United States and who's written extensively on white privilege, the invisible knapsack of additional power and then advantages that white people have in a race-based society, she says, as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something which puts others at a disadvantage, but I had been taught not to see one of the corollary aspects, which is that white privilege puts me at an advantage. And I think that white people are carefully taught not to recognize this white privilege. This goes the same for men in a society where male dominance is assumed. They don't see that they have those privileges. It goes the same for heterosexuals not seeing the privilege that they have in relation to homosexuals because they never have to think about their sexual identity in public. Privilege groups are the standard of comparison, the best that society has to offer. So it's important to think about the question, what are the divisions in Finland? Who's the marked or other, and who's considered the norm or normal? And as you think about yourself, when you look upward in the power structure, do you see people who are like you on all the different dimensions of your identity? Do people look like you or share important qualities? Is there somebody that you can identify with? And if not, why or why not? And then very importantly, let's think about your students. Consider the different dimensions of privilege along race, gender, sexual orientation, geography, religion. And what do your students see when they see you? What privileges do you have, or do they have, or not as a result? And what might have been earned and what's unearned? So remember, there's nothing wrong with having privilege because you didn't construct the social context that gives it to you. So it's what we do when we have privilege that matters. In relationship to racism, for example, we're not responsible for having been born white, but we are accountable for how we respond to racism and dominance in our schools and our communities today. It's what we do about racism that makes a difference. It's that we become anti-racist, or we fight against anti-Muslim feelings, or we are anti-homophobia. That's what's important, not that we have the privileges that we have. So the last question is, why don't most groups and people from the dominant group fight oppression? One answer is they don't even know that it exists in the first place. A big part of it is that they don't have to. You can live a perfectly easy life, enjoying your privileges and not paying attention to those that are marginalized. Some people think it's just an individual problem if someone's oppressed, and people usually get what they deserve. Some people recognize that they have privilege and they want to hang on to it. Some people are prejudiced, they're racist, they're sexist, they're heterosexist, they're ableists. And to a great extent, people are afraid. People are afraid of differences. They're afraid to change, they're afraid to know the other. But the great joy in doing this work and creating classroom communities is that when we drop our fears and we seek to open ourselves to other people, we gain even more than our students do.